Even though Tubi is known for having a bunch of bogus movies, they can actually have better movies than Netflix or Prime, but you do have to dig for them, and that's what I did to make this list of the most shocking movies I could find included with Tubi. But there's some bangers on this list. Thanks to Beam for sponsoring another video, but my bottom pick on this list, the first movie we're going to talk about, is far and away the most shocking movie on this list and is well known for being one of the more shocking movies ever made. It's titled Martyrs. Believe it or not, this is a French-Canadian movie and it is mixed language. There's French and English. And even though this is often included on lists of the most disturbing movies ever made, Martyrs, it actually has an interesting story, or at least an interesting concept at its core. There's actually something kind of supernatural happening with this one, so it goes into very, very disturbing territory. Please don't misunderstand me. I am not recommending this particular movie for everybody watching. Martyrs is in an exceptionally brutal movie watching experience, so it's kind of like hot sauce. Like, people like watching movies like this to see how much they can take. I'm not a big fan of that, but Martyrs, again, does stand out as having something interesting going on rather than just debauchery and gore. But my next pick will change up the tone quite a bit, and believe it or not, it's one of Ben Stiller's most underrated movies and one of his most shocking. It's titled Permanent Midnight.
Like that, you turn around and the swimming pool opens up below everybody, and then we go right back into the scene. You never even make any mention of it. It's all unsaid. You know what that is? You know what that shit is? That's hot.
Now, in this movie, he actually plays a heroin addict, but this is actually the true story of a famous sitcom writer. He actually wrote for famous shows like Alf in the 80s, and he had a massive heroin habit. This is also one of the first times he and Owen Wilson teamed up. Elizabeth Hurley plays his girlfriend. There's actually quite a bit of comedy to this movie, but you wouldn't call it a comedy, and the drug stuff is not insanely stomach-turning. I mean, there are some moments in this movie that are quite upsetting, but the way that it's filmed is actually pretty accessible, making Permanent Midnight a pretty solid movie, which I think also speaks to how strong the rest of the recommendations are on this list. Now, my next pick is a remake of a very disturbing cop movie. Somehow the remake made it even more disturbing, and somehow this remake is one of the few feature films from legendary director Werner Herzog. While he has done a handful of fictional stories like this, I feel like he's most known for his documentary work. But Bad Lieutenant is a remake of a famous Harvey Keitel film. This version actually stars Nicolas Cage, which is kind of an odd casting choice, but Nicolas Cage actually makes this work quite well. He goes over the top sometimes, but he's not going full throttle the entire movie. And Bad Lieutenant ends up being an interesting cop movie, but it does have some stomach-turning elements to it. If you've seen the original, they actually crank things up a little bit with this Nicolas Cage version. The movie as a whole isn't completely shocking, but there are some jaw-dropping moments in Bad Lieutenant. Now, my next pick is a horror movie. There's only really about 5 on this list that qualify as horror, but this one actually stars Bradley Cooper before he was famous, and Vinnie Jones in a very bizarre role, one of his most bizarre, in Midnight Meat Train. Now, this is actually based on the writings of Clive Barker, the creator of Hellraiser and Nightbreed, a movie I love that I've recommended recently here on the channel. Now, he did not direct this movie, and you can tell it just doesn't have that quintessential Clive Barker vibe. If anything, it feels a bit by the book for most of the movie. It feels like something you would go to the movie theater to see, something kind of basic, not too interesting, and then it takes a turn, a Clive Barker turn, and gets real wild. And I especially love the fact that Bradley Cooper, like an award-winning actor, is in this movie with so many bizarre elements. Anyone who likes really weird, creepy horror movies, again, this one's not super weird, but like everything on this list, it does have some shocking moments in it. While my number 14 pick is horrific, it is not a horror movie, but it too is based on a true story. It actually stars Daniel Radcliffe, lost in the jungle in Jungle.
The jungle.
Could you pop it in a sentence?
The trees, the bugs, the jungle.
The jungle?
Yes, that is what I said.
Yeah, that was from Disney's Jungle Cruise, but in Jungle, a group of backpackers get lost in the Bolivian jungle. A very hostile place, they cannot get out, making Jungle a wilderness survival movie, but by the time you finish it, it is an exhausting experience. I mean, Daniel Radcliffe lost a bunch of weight for this movie, and he has to go through some horrific stuff to reach the end of the film. There's nothing revolutionary with Jungle, it doesn't change the face of wilderness survival movies in any kind of way, but if you typically like that genre or you're a fan of Daniel Radcliffe, this is a great one to watch, but just be warned. He deals with some rough stuff in this flick. Okay, my next pick is the lightest one on this list. In fact, it's a PG-13 comedy. It's one I've loved since it released, since I was 14 years old, I think, probably when I saw this movie. Norm Macdonald's Dirty Work.
He was supposed to keep driving.
Now, I'm a huge fan of Norm. I think he's one of the greatest stand-ups of my generation. And this is my favorite movie of his. He only did a handful, but Dirty Work is just a real gem. A lot of great comedy actors and cameos, including one from Chris Farley that's particularly hilarious. And this movie was directed by Bob Saget. And it was not long after his tenure as the host of America's Funniest Home Videos and the dad on Full House. Wanting to break away from that, he did this actually fairly raunchy movie with Norm Macdonald and Artie Lang that I still watch today, and I laugh all the way through it. Next up, we've got a David Cronenberg classic that I've only just recently watched, but like all David Cronenberg movies, it is visually shocking, and it also happens to be one of his first big movies. It's titled Rabid. Now, this is a zombie flick, basically, but it's got a very different setup than a zombie flick. Adult film star Marilyn Chambers actually stars in this as a woman who undergoes some experimental plastic surgery. She then develops this strange little hole in her armpit. If you've seen any David Cronenberg movies before, you know what the hole looks like. He's a big fan of putting this disgusting little hole on things, but she begins infecting people, and it's essentially a zombie flick with a different setup and take. Like all David Cronenberg movies, there's a heavy sexual element to it, and just a bizarre sexual element to it, not a pleasant one. But also, like all David Cronenberg movies, it's shot like beautifully. It's got this really cool, creep-tastic vibe to it that only he has really been able to nail. I would say if you're a fan of some of his other movies, Rabid definitely stands out as like a very David Cronenberg movie and a very 70s one at that. But speaking of creepy holes, my next pick really takes the cake. I mean, it's not as disturbing as Martyrs, but it too it's got one of the more disturbing concepts on this movie, and visually, I'll say, teeth is equally disturbing. This is about a young girl with a mutation that actually causes her to have very sharp teeth. They're inside of her vagina. Now, this movie is a little tongue-in-cheek. It is funny at times, but it also takes this bizarre concept pretty seriously. Sexual assault is one of the themes of the movie, so is abstinence. In fact, all the themes are sexual in nature, but this is not just a gross-out flick. I mean, yes, they are trying to gross you out in multiple ways throughout this movie, but it takes that concept and makes good use of it. Like, for lack of a better word, she puts her powers to use in this movie. And for this dark, weird movie with a bizarre tone, like teeth, while I don't think it's a masterpiece or anything, it does manage to work. The bizarre tone serves this movie well. It actually makes it fairly entertaining at times, upsetting at times, and way more interesting than you would initially suspect. Okay, my next pick is a just stunning art house film. It is a beautifully shot movie about some disgustingly hideous trolls. But before that, I do want to tell you how you can get some of the best sleep of your life with the help of today's sponsor, Dream by Beam. And that's because Dream is a luxurious drink mixture that is loaded with some of the best sleep-promoting ingredients. It's a powder that you mix with just a little bit of warm milk or water, about 30 minutes to an hour before bedtime. I typically enjoy mine halfway through my last movie of the day. Dream has been clinically shown to help you fall asleep faster, stay asleep, and most importantly, wake up feeling refreshed. I mean, honestly, something that helps you sleep but that also makes you feel groggy in the morning just defeats its own purpose. And I enjoy taking Dream before bed some nights, even though I'm not someone who has chronic sleep issues. In fact, I stay busy enough that I often fall asleep right away. And at my age, you know, I've got young children, I've got a 40-year-old bladder that could wake me up in the middle of the night. But whatever the reason, I do find on nights when I've had Dream before bed, I tend to fall right back to sleep with no trouble. Again, wake up feeling fresh. Dream is available in a CBD version and a non-CBD version. I have been taking the non-CBD version. And it comes in different flavors. We've got the original here, which is kind of like a cocoa cinnamon flavor. Again, very luxurious and nice, but here is a brownie flavor. They've got chocolate peanut butter, chocolate mint, and Dream is gluten-free, dairy-free with no GMOs, no added sugars, and no artificial flavors. So if you want to try it out and be a better, more well-rested version of yourself this year, my viewers for a limited time are going to save 35% off their first order when they go to shopbeam.com/flick, or you can just use this QR code. I've also put the link down in the video description. Again, that's 35% off on something that's going to help you get quality rest. It's something I really do enjoy, but speaking of things I enjoy, let's get back to the movies on this list. So, Border is a fantasy movie. The main character is a troll. She knows that she's a troll and that she's different from other people. But the way Border is set up feels very grounded. It feels like she's this mythical being living amongst us in hiding, making it just a very realistic feeling fantasy movie. And then one day she meets someone else like her. Again, the movie is just beautifully shot. It is a breathtaking flick, and it ultimately goes somewhere pretty shocking. Now, the movie overall isn't really that shocking until you get to the sex scene between the two trolls. Like, I mean, there's just no words I can use to describe it. Fungal is maybe a word I could use to describe it, but I'm going to move on. That part is incredibly shocking, but then the gut punch you get towards the end of this movie is a total shocker. Even with me telling you that it exists, this movie packs a punch. But we'll jump from that real serious art flick to Striptease. Yes, a classic Darren Van Dam move, but Striptease is so much better now than I think it even was back when it was released. Even though it was a hit movie, critics really derided it and did not like it, but it has held up as a really funny, raunchy comedy. And with all of Demi Moore's success with The Substance this year, it's almost worth going back and watching a couple of scenes in this movie. Like, the fitness level that she reached for Striptease is beyond outrageous. And she also did a great job with all the dance routines. But on top of those entertaining elements, you also get like Ving Rhames doing a really funny character. Robert Patrick's hilarious in this movie, but nobody is funnier than Burt Reynolds in Striptease. This is the funniest I think he's ever been. I mean, he did a bunch of comedies, but his role as this sex-crazy congressman is the funniest thing I've ever seen him do, and probably the funniest thing on this list.
Why are you all shiny?
It's Vaseline.
Oh, it's Vaseline.
You've never covered yourself with Vaseline.
No, not unless I have third-degree burns, no.
You don't know what you're missing. I can feel it squishing between my toes.
All right, okay.
But in another classic Darren Van Dam move, I'm gonna juke, and we're gonna go with my next pick, which comes from 1956. And believe it or not, it is a shocker. It's titled The Bad Seed. Now, this was a shocker for 1956. It is not gonna leave your jaw on the floor here in 2025, but the concept might. This movie is about a young girl who is murderous. I mean, not only murderous, but just absolutely devious. I actually remember seeing this on TV when I was fairly young. My young sister saw it as well. And just reciting some of the lines the girl would say to my sister was enough to just creep her out when we were growing up, making this just real gem. Now, it's not particularly well shot or directed. It's got kind of an Alfred Hitchcock vibe in terms of its script and its concept, but not quite. It's not really there in terms of quality. I'm just saying that to say that Alfred Hitchcock fans, if you've somehow never seen The Bad Seed, it's a short watch, and retrospectively, it's a very enjoyable one. Now, I'm digging around in my brain, trying to find another movie more shocking than my next pick that stars Michael Caine, and I don't think he's ever done anything quite as intense as Harry Brown. This movie has quite a bit in common with movies like Walking Tall and Death Wish. Michael Caine's an elderly man who's just surrounded by crime and thuggery, and he decides he's had enough of it, so he starts to fight back. But this is not like a Liam Neeson action movie where this old man is just whooping ass. No, he goes and gets a gun and kind of outsmarts some criminals in some very realistic and grounded ways. Now, while the entire film is actually fairly shocking for a Michael Caine movie, there is one sequence in particular that stood out in this movie to me, and it's the first time I remember seeing the actor Sean Harris. He is so frightening in Harry Brown, and he would go on to play amazing villains in a bunch of movies, including a couple of Mission Impossible movies. But my goodness, his scene in Harry Brown still haunts me. You've also got Jack O'Connell in this movie before he was famous. Plan B has a little role and a really great track at the end of the film. I love this movie, but it is a tough watch. My next pick is an award winner. In fact, I'll go ahead and admit, as I was making this video, I had two lists going of movies on Tubi. I had shocking movies, which is what I ultimately went with, but I also had a concept for a video about good movies with bad sex scenes. I actually came up with quite a list. Here it is. But Monsters Ball made that list because it is an amazing movie, even though it deals with a very dark subject matter. But my goodness, the sex scene with Billy Bob Thornton and Halle Berry, I can't show it to you here, obviously, but it also takes place between the couch and the coffee table, which is a tight spot. Now, she won an Academy Award for this movie, and you can see why. It's like a career best for her, but the movie as a whole is actually really fantastic. Heath Ledger even has a great role in this movie. A short-lived one, but a great one. Yes, P. Diddy is in this movie. He may not even have lines, to my recollection. If he does, he's out of the movie by the time the opening credits are over with. Okay, just like Martyrs, my next pick is not for everybody. This is going to be for people who are seeking out an intense movie watching experience, but The Eyes of My Mother is one of the most intense things I've seen since the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. By the way, the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre is also included on Tubi right now. Now, The Eyes of My Mother is a much slower paced film. It is not about a crazed maniac. Rather, it's about this young girl who grows up on this very remote farm where she bears witness to some pretty horrific things, including the murder of her mother. Now, that's just the first few minutes of this movie. Most of the movie revolves around her being a grown woman living alone on this remote farm with a very warped view of how the world works and how compassion works, which actually sets The Eyes of My Mother up for a very chilling movie watching experience. Like, there's not necessarily a bad guy after you get past the beginning, but some of the things that happen to people in The Eyes of My Mother is nightmare fuel, pure nightmare fuel. Again though, with this very sympathetic main character, it's kind of a confusing movie emotionally. Now, it is very slow paced, it's very artsy, but also shockingly effective. Next up, I've got another award winner with the first feature film from director Alejandro Iñárritu, who's most known for movies like The Revenant, Birdman, and Babel. But his first feature film is Amores Perros, which translates to Love of Dogs or Love's a Bitch. Now, people who are sensitive to dogs getting hurt in movies, this is one of the most notorious ones of all time. Do not watch this flick if you can't handle that stuff. In fact, this movie opens up with a very shocking car chase, but it's kind of like an anthology film, similar to his other movie, Babel. It's different stories that do have dogs connected to them in different ways, but the stories are about different forms of love, and then ultimately they all tie together very well. In fact, I'll admit, I'm not a big fan of this method of storytelling, this, anthology that gets tied together. I find them to be kind of loose and cumbersome, like Babel, for instance, but Amores Perros pulls that off more successfully than I think anything else I've seen done that way. Now, I mentioned Alfred Hitchcock. I do not have an Alfred Hitchcock movie on this list, but I've got an excellent Brian De Palma film where he's essentially trying to recreate an Alfred Hitchcock film. Now, if you didn't know, when Alfred Hitchcock movies came out, they were incredibly shocking. They are not very shocking today, but they were when they released. So anytime a director is trying to recapture that magic in today's world, they go for some shocking scenes. A great example from last year is Strange Darling. It was actually my favorite movie of the year and feels a lot like a modern-day Alfred Hitchcock flick. Body Double, though, is what we're talking about here. It was released in the 80s, and it feels like an 80s movie more than almost any other 80s movie I've ever seen. But the movie revolves around a guy, you wouldn't quite call him a peeping Tom. I mean, he's got a telescope, he notices a woman changing in another building. It's not like he was looking for that sort of thing. But anyway, he's spying on a woman, he becomes gradually obsessed with her, and then notices that she's in danger and he tries to help her. Not only is all that stuff interesting, but then he develops a relationship with another woman who's actually a porn star played by Melanie Griffith. She bizarrely doesn't really show up until the final act of the movie, but they have a couple of crazy scenes that I was shocked by, and then there's violence in this movie that is very shocking, especially for the 1980s. So, it's a Brian De Palma, sex-laden Alfred Hitchcock thriller that, again, will raise some eyebrows. It also happens to be quite a bit of fun to watch. All the way at my number 2 spot, we've got just an all-out comedy that just, even today, I feel like this movie is shocking, maybe even more so than it was back when it originally released. Four Lions.
What are you doing? In case they're taking pictures. What? Buddy says you come out blurry.
Now this stars Riz Ahmed in one of his first really big roles that he was recognized for, but he and 3 other terrorists are actually trying to plan a terrorist attack in London, which is disturbing on its face. In fact, their casual nature as they're planning all this stuff is even more disturbing. But luckily, they're a bunch of buffoons, and the movie is hilarious. I mean, they cannot really get this thing pulled together, mainly because the 3 accomplices he has are all dumb as a box of rocks. Now, I've watched this movie multiple times, and it is a riot every time, but the first watch, especially in the final act, as they are actively trying to pull off a terror attack, is quite shocking. Like, it's hard to tell where it's headed, what their ultimate revelations about all their actions are going to be. And again, in today's climate, it is a kind of hair-raising concept of a movie, but luckily, it leans heavier on the comedy and ends up just being a really silly and fun movie. And then my number 1 pick is not the most shocking movie on this list, even though it does have some really shocking elements in it, but it is also a Hitchcockian twisted thriller directed by Steven Soderbergh. It's titled Side Effects. Now, despite having a pretty big cast, including Channing Tatum, Jude Law, and Rooney Mara, this movie is not very well known, but it has some of the best twists and turns out of anything I've mentioned on this list, which is why it earns the number 1 spot. Rooney Mara plays a psychiatric patient who is medicated, who then stabs her husband, played by Channing Tatum, and Jude Law, her psychiatrist, is trying to figure out if she did this on purpose or if there's something else, maybe side effects from the medication she took. That's kind of the surface level of this movie, but this thing rolls deep. In fact, once you get towards the end of this movie, the twists themselves are the real shockers. Yes, some of the content is pretty shocking, including some sexy elements that'll take you by surprise, but again, the twists and turns and side effects are still surprising to me today, which is why it earned the number 1 spot on this list. If you like the idea of never running out of good movies to watch, or hell, just never spending an hour trying to find something to watch again, definitely click that subscribe button, maybe even a like. That always helps these videos reach more viewers similar to you. Don't forget to check out the Beam link down in the video description if you want to start getting better sleep like I have, but I'll keep making these videos as long as y'all keep watching them. Thanks for watching this Tubi episode, and you will see me on the next one.